Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, a show about people who have died recently who've had a profound impact on history or society. And tonight we have a sort of a special program in the sense that we have a special subject. We're going to talk about Osama Bin Laden. Now, when you hear this program, it's about a month after Osama Bin Laden was killed by special United States forces. For production reasons and for reasons of perspective, we usually take a couple of weeks before we discuss the subjects. And that gives us a chance to look at Osama bin Laden and what has been written and said about his death. It's very difficult to discuss Osama bin Laden's death without resorting to emotion, discuss emotionally what he was responsible for, or as just a simple straight news story recounting facts as we would do with everyone else. Clearly, Osama bin Laden's death is a news story. It's perhaps the biggest news story of the last decade, but it's not a news story in the sense of the death of a head of state. There are occasionally figures who fall into the same category as Osama: Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot. These people's deaths are covered worldwide by newspapers, television, radio, and the coverage depends on where you are. But we are afforded some perspective. We can step back after a couple of weeks and look at them in a different way, and Osama bin Laden is one of them. What I thought I would do is I would use the BBC4 Last Word done by Matthew Bannister, which is perhaps the best obit radio program in the world, so you could get an idea of how the BBC looked at Osama bin Laden from a non-emotional, objective view. They certainly didn't paint him positively. They certainly painted him negatively, but they used interviews with journalists to give perspective on what is not only an obituary, but a news event. You will notice in the pictures that we use accompanying our podcast, we will not show a picture of Osama bin Laden, either alive or dead. We will show simply some of the events that he was responsible for, including the 9/11 bombings of the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, the bombing of Khobar Towers, the 7/7 bus attack in London, the Madrid bombings, the Bali nightclub bombing, and the bombing of the USS Cole. Here is Matthew Bannister from Last Word discussing the death of Osama bin Laden.
America came under attack today from international terrorists on a scale that made it more an act of war. The center of New York is still smoldering with America's...
There's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said, "Wanted, dead or alive."
There's been international condemnation of the bomb attack on the Indonesian island of Bali. At least
he may be dead, he may be seriously wounded, he may be in Afghanistan, he may be somewhere else.
Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda.
As with his acts of terror, the death of Osama bin Laden echoed around the world, creating thousands of hours of reporting and analysis. The facts of his life have been much discussed. Osama was raised in a palace in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, paid for by his father's successful construction business. He was polite, hard-working, and appeared devout. He studied civil engineering at university, but at the same time was exposed to the radical preachers who laid the foundation of his future murderous ideology. But what was it like to sit face-to-face with the world's most wanted man? On Last Word today, we talked to three people who met Osama bin Laden. First, Robert Fisk is the Middle East correspondent of the Independent newspaper. He interviewed Osama bin Laden 3 times in the 1990s and talked to him about his family background.
So many half-brothers and half-sisters that he wasn't quite sure when I talked to him exactly how many he had. 52, I think, is the correct figure. Grew up in considerable luxury, holidays in Sweden. He himself told me in Afghanistan that he was once taken for a holiday in London. I asked him what he remembered. He said red buses. But, of course, later on, he distinguished himself in the war against the Soviets by leading, effectively, an Arab Legion.
Numan bin Otman was part of a jihadist insurgency in Libya in the 1980s. He has since turned his back on radicalism and now campaigns against violence. But for a time, he was a close confidant of Osama bin Laden.
If anybody met with him, it's the same person, so there is no differences whatsoever. That's Bin Laden. Very calm, very cool, very hard to provoke.
And you were effectively a comrade in arms at the time when you first came into contact with him. How did he treat you?
He was very, very good listener. Even if you dispute with him, he was very, very calm.
What did you dispute with him, and how did the conversation go?
By argument, it was like, to be honest with you, against all his activities, including his group, Al-Qaeda, like the outcomes of the jihadi movement. It's a total failure.
And what was his reaction when you told him that it was a complete failure?
He smiled a lot. I can remember. It was very, very wide smile, because I believe he didn't expect that to happen.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak.
George Bush Sr. announcing the start of the First Gulf War, a turning point in Osama bin Laden's attitude to the West.
When Saddam Hussein's legions invaded Kuwait in 1990, he went to the royal family and said, "Let my Arab fighters and myself get Saddam out. Don't invite the Americans." And the Saudis preferred to bring the Americans to the country of the two holy places. And bin Laden thought this was an outrageous act against God.
I believe bin Laden was believing he was the chosen one, something maybe metaphysical, I have this impression, honestly, That's why he managed to go through a lot of conflicts. Sometimes it's very hard to explain, He believed he was the chosen one, and like maybe hands of God, taking care of him.
Do you think that Osama bin Laden was in a way proud of his status as an internationally reviled figure?
Yeah, he was proud of himself
The Al-Qaeda people hung on his every word as if he was a messiah or a Mahdi. He's about the only figure I've ever interviewed in my life who, instead of saying that, you ask a question, most people say the first thing that comes into their mind so they don't look stupid or feel stupid. And he would sit there for a minute, sometimes up to 3 minutes, in complete silence, cleaning his teeth with a piece of wood. And then when he came with his answer, it was in complete sentences. He was a very self-confident but also very self-righteous man, and I thought he was becoming increasingly vain each time I saw him. And self-confidence and self-righteousness are very dangerous qualities if they're brought together with violence.
Barka Atiani is bureau chief in Islamabad for Al Arabiya Television. He was summoned to meet Osama bin Laden and his deputy Ayman al-Zawahiri in Afghanistan just before the September the 11th attacks in 2001. After a tortuous journey lasting many hours, he eventually arrived at bin Laden's hideout near Kandahar.
It was a very big house. Interestingly, I went today to the place where bin Laden was killed. Interestingly, almost the same walls, high walls, and big house.
And were there a lot of people around when you met him, or was he on his own?
Yeah, inside the house there were some armed guys, around maybe 10, 15. But in the meeting room, he was sitting along with Ayman Zawahiri, the second man, and Abu Hafs, Muhammad Atif, the military commander of Al-Qaeda.
So what impression did Osama bin Laden himself make on you as you sat there opposite him?
He was very quiet. He don't talk much, calm, and he was trying to listen more than to talk, actually. And there was another guy, I don't know his name, I think he was an Egyptian. They said the coming weeks will carry a big surprise. We will target American and Israeli installations. So I was looking at him. He said, "You can carry this," yes. And he was smiling.
So you think that they were giving you hints about what happened on 9/11?
Indeed, yes.
Was it frightening to sit with Osama bin Laden?
I can say it's frightening, but I can say for me as a journalist, a real experience.
The only sort of disturbing moment I had was the third time I saw him, when he walked into the tent in his training camp, which of course was originally built by the CIA, and said to me, "One of our brothers had a dream that you, Mr. Robert, came to us riding on a horse," a symbol of chivalry in the Arab Muslim world, wearing the clothes of an imam. And this means you're a good Muslim. And I was absolutely convinced, I think rightly, that he was trying to recruit me. And I said to him, "I'm not a Muslim, Sheikh Osama. I'm a journalist and my job is to tell the truth." And there was an awful lot of silence. And of course, I didn't want to upset him in front of all his armed men. At the same time, I wanted to make it very clear to him that he was crossing my red line. And then he said, "Well, being a journalist and telling the truth is the same as being a good Muslim." And I breathed a sigh of relief.
Did he have genuine power in the organization? Was he able to just issue an order and have it be done? Or was he more a symbolic leader?
No, honestly, if he issued an order, I'm strongly believe it will be followed. Yeah, I haven't got doubt about that.
So his writ ran?
Yes, you're right.
I think he was totally out of touch with events. But you see, for him, in his eyes, his creation of Al-Qaeda was his achievement. After that, it didn't matter. But of course, what's actually happened is he was a complete failure. He said to me several times, I want an Islamic caliphate, and we are going to depose Mubarak and Ben Ali and Hafez al-Assad, of course, at that stage. And in fact, he totally failed. It was the people of Egypt, the people of Tunisia, not under Islamic flags, but under their own national flags that overthrew their dictators. And it's the people of Syria who are trying to get rid of Hafez al-Assad's son, and the people of Yemen are trying to get rid of Saleh, and Libyans against Gaddafi. They don't want a caliphate. They want a democracy. They want to breathe. And the one question I would love to have asked him was how he felt when he saw the pictures of Tahrir Square and realized that he had failed and they were winning.
Robert Fisk on Osama Bin-Laden, who's died aged 54.
That was BBC 4. Later this year, we hope to have a podcast interview with several of the top obituary writers in the United States on the subject of what to write about people like Osama bin Laden, what type of coverage we should have of the internationally notorious figure who dies. We're going to move on now to Dr. David Sencer, who was the head of the Centers for Disease Control from 1966 to 1977 and played a key role in the swine flu controversy of late 1976. Dr. Sencer lost his job over that, and it was covered by Mike Wallace in 60 Minutes, and I will intersperse some of the interview between Dr. Sencer and Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes, and I'll intersperse them with some of the events as they occurred in 1976. In 1918, a worldwide influenza pandemic killed more people than were killed in World War I, tens of millions of people. There were minor pandemics after that throughout the next 50 years, but in 1976, a strain of swine flu was isolated from a recruit at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and this posed the threat of another worldwide pandemic. Here's Mike Wallace.
Where did this so-called deadly variety of flu, where did it first hit back in 1976? It began right here at Fort Dix in New Jersey in January of that year when a number of recruits began to complain of respiratory ailments, something like the common cold. An Army doctor here sent samples of their throat cultures to the New Jersey Public Health Lab to find out just what kind of bug was going around here. One of those samples was from a Private David Lewis who had left his sickbed to go on a forced march. Private Lewis had collapsed on that march, and his sergeant had revived him by mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. A few days later, Private Lewis died. The New Jersey lab identified most of those soldiers' throat cultures as the normal kind of flu virus going around that year, but they could not make out what kind of virus was in the culture from the dead soldier and from 4 others who were sick. So they sent those cultures to the Federal Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, for further study. A few days later, they got the verdict: swine flu. But that much-publicized outbreak of swine flu at Fort Dix involved only Private Lewis, who died, and those 4 other soldiers who recovered completely without the swine flu shot.
When the government realized that this was swine flu, it set off a mini panic because there was fear of a worldwide pandemic. There was an immediate push by the CDC to develop, manufacture, and distribute a swine flu vaccine to as many Americans as possible, as quickly as possible. I was looking for a residency at that time. One of the places I was looking was Presbyterian Hospital in Pittsburgh at the University of Pittsburgh, and they were one of the main hospitals involved in the swine flu program, and the head of the swine flu program was Dr. David Sencer, who died recently. Here he is with Mike Wallace.
Dr. David Sencer, then head of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, is now in private industry. He devised the swine flu program, and he pushed it.
The rationale for our recommendation was not on the basis of the death of a single individual, but it was on the basis that when we do see a change in the characteristics of the influenza virus, it is a massive public health problem in this country.
Well, the government publicity campaign was certainly massive. Here are a couple of commercials urging everyone to get the swine flu vaccine.
I don't need another flu shot. I had a flu shot last year. A swine flu epidemic may be coming.
Swine flu shot? Well, I don't know. I've been thinking about it.
It could make you very sick. Swine flu? Man, I'm too fast today to catch me.
You'll want to be protected.
I'm the healthiest 55-year-old you ever seen. Hey, I play golf every weekend.
Get a shot of protection. The swine flu shot.
Joe brought it home from the office. He gave it to Betty and one of his kids and to Betty's mother. But Betty's mother went back to California the next day. On her way to the airport, she gave it to a cab driver, a ticket agent, and one of the charming stewardesses. At school, Joe's kid gave it to some other kids, and Mrs. Merrill got it and gave it to her husband. In California, Betty's mother gave it to her best friend, Dottie. But Dottie had a heart condition and she died. But before she died, Dottie gave it to her girlfriend, the mailman, the paper boy, and the vet when she went to pick up her chihuahua.
If the swine flu epidemic comes, this is how it could spread. You'll want to be protected, especially if you're elderly or chronically ill. Get a shot of protection. The swine flu shot.
Here's President Gerald Ford going on national television in 1976.
This virus was the cause of a pandemic in 1918 and 1919 that resulted in over 500,000 deaths in the United States, as well as 20 million deaths around the world.
By the way, just for your information, the number 20 million is a radical understatement. It was probably between 50 and 100 million. Pay attention to this popular commercial of the day, especially the part where the announcer says the vaccine is safe.
Influenza is serious business. During major flu epidemics, millions of people are sick and thousands die. Well, this year you can get protection. The vaccines are safe, easy to take, and they can protect you against flu. So roll up your sleeve. Protect yourself.
Sounded great in theory. I remember a conference I was at the University of Pittsburgh, and it sure convinced me. There were only two problems. The first problem was that the influenza pandemic from swine flu never materialized. The second problem was that a number of people contracted a neurologic disease called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which was associated with the vaccine. Suddenly, vaccinated people would develop a disease where they could not move their muscles and there was a block between their muscles and their nerves. Some people died, other people were paralyzed for a short time or were weak for a longer period of time, and this looked to be directly related to the vaccine. The whole thing turned out to be a debacle, including lawsuits and all sorts of recriminations, and at the center of it all was Dr. Sencer.
You began to give flu shots to the American people in October of 76.
October 1st.
By that time, how many cases of swine flu around the world had been reported?
There had been several reported, but none confirmed. There had been cases in Australia that were reported by the press, by the news media. There were cases in...
None confirmed. Did you ever uncover any other outbreaks of swine flu anywhere in the world?
No.
It was up to the CDC to come up with some kind of official consent form, giving the public all the information it needed about the swine flu shot. This form stated that the swine flu vaccine had been tested. What it didn't say was that after those tests were completed, the scientists developed another vaccine, and that was the one given to most of the 46 million who took the shot. That vaccine was called X53A.
Was X53A ever field tested?
I can't say. I would have to...
It wasn't.
I don't know.
Well, I would think that you're in charge of the program.
I would have to check the records. I haven't looked at this in some time.
Did anyone ever come to you and say, you know something, fellas? There's the possibility of neurological damage if you get into a mass immunization program?
No.
No one ever did?
No.
Do you know Michael Hapwick?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Now you know you're having a bad day when Mike Wallace walks into your office with a camera crew, and it only gets worse for Dr. Sencer from here.
Dr. Michael Hapwick directed the surveillance team for the swine flu program at the CDC. His job was to find out what possible complications could arise from taking the shot and to report his findings to those in charge.
Did you know ahead of time, Dr. Hapwick, that there had been case reports of neurological disorders, neurological illness, apparently associated with the injection of influenza vaccine?
Absolutely.
You did?
Yes.
How'd you know that?
By review of the literature.
So you told your superiors, the men in charge of the swine flu immunization program, about the possibility of neurological disorders?
Absolutely.
What would you say if I told you that your superiors say that you never told them about the possibility of neurological complications?
That's nonsense. I can't believe that they would say that they did not know that there were neurological illnesses associated with influenza vaccination. That simply is not true. We did know that.
Dr. Sencer didn't see it that way.
I've said that Dr. Hatwick had never told me of his feelings on this subject.
That he's lying.
I guess you would have to make that assumption.
Then why does this report from your own agency, dated July 1976, list neurological complications as a possibility?
I think the consensus of the scientific community was that the evidence relating neurologic disorders to influenza immunization was such that they did not feel that this association was a real one.
You didn't feel it was necessary to tell the people that information?
I think that over the years we have tried to inform the American people as fully as possible.
This is a bad train wreck that's only getting worse. In a minute, Dr. Sencer's going to have Laura Petrie on his back, too.
As part of informing Americans about the swine flu threat, Dr. Sencer's CDC also helped create the advertising to get the public to take the shot.
Let me read to you from one of your own agency's memos planning the campaign to urge Americans to take the shot. The swine flu vaccine has been taken by many important persons, he wrote. Example, President Ford, Henry Kissinger, Elton John, Muhammad Ali, Mary Tyler Moore, Rudolph Nureyev, Walter Cronkite, Ralph Nader, Edward Kennedy, etc., etc. True?
I'm not familiar with that particular piece of paper, but I do know that at least of that group, President Ford did take the vaccination.
Did you talk to these people beforehand to find out if they planned to take the shot?
I did not know.
Did anybody?
I do not know.
Did you get permission to use their names in your campaign?
I do not know.
Well, you know Mike Wallace is going to go to Mary Tyler Moore at that point.
Mary, did you take a swine flu shot?
No, I did not.
Did you give them permission to use your name saying that you had or were going to?
Absolutely not. Never did.
Did you ask your own doctor about taking the swine flu shot?
Yes, and at the time he thought it might be a good idea. But I resisted it because I was leery of having the symptoms that sometimes go with that kind of inoculation.
So you didn't?
No, I didn't.
Have you spoken to your doctor since?
Yes.
And?
He's delighted that I didn't take that shot.
So were Rob and Lou Grant. Back to Dr. Sencer, though.
You're in charge. Somebody's in charge. This is your advertising strategy that I have a copy of here.
Who's it signed by?
This one is unsigned. But you'll acknowledge that it was your baby, so to speak.
It could have been from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. It could be from CDC. I don't know. I'll be happy to take responsibility for it.
Okay, I think you get the idea. Dr. Sencer messed up real bad with the swine flu campaign. There were lawsuits, as I said, there were deaths, and Dr. Sencer became a victim of the campaign. He was released by the government from being the head of the CDC. He went into the private sector. He actually got a job with New York City as the New York City Health Commissioner during the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. So he went from the frying pan into the fire. He caught a lot of grief there for AIDS policies, which may not have been his fault, but you get roasted by Mike Wallace, and then Larry Kramer and the AIDS activists torch you on top of it. Not a lot of good career moves for David Sencer. We're going to say a merciful goodbye to him. Before I close tonight, I'd like to make a brief mention of Moshe Landau, who died. Moshe Landau died in Israel. He was a Supreme Court justice in Israel for many years, and he became famous as the presiding magistrate at the Eichmann trial. It is the 50th anniversary of the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the high-ranking Nazis who was captured in Argentina 15 years after the war, and he was the man in the glass booth. He was tried in an Israeli court, sentenced to death for his complicity in sending millions of Jews to the gas chamber, and Moshe Landau was the judge who was in charge of the trial. He was a very intelligent, fair-minded man. He was also the head of a commission that investigated Shin Bet, the Israeli Secret Service, for abuses. So Moshe Landau was an upright figure for over 50 years in the Israeli justice system. I want to thank my producer Sid Tepps. And in closing, I'm going to go with Don McLean describing our main subject tonight.
Fire is the devil's only friend. Oh, and as I watched him on the stage, my hands were clenched in fists of rage. No angel born in hell could break that Satan's spell.